Europe has had enough of relying on the United States to defend it. The European Union, or EU, has just revealed a drastic new plan that ensures all of its member nations grow stronger. This is terrible news for Russian President Vladimir Putin, as he continues his push to take Ukraine. However, it's also a shot across the bow of the US. Europe is going to make itself unstoppable, with or without the United States. How? By dedicating more money to defense spending than ever before. On March 4th, EU President Ursula von der Leyen released a press statement on the organization's website. She noted that Europeans are living in the most momentous and dangerous times, pointing out the entire continent faces a grave threat. Von der Leyen didn't name names, but it's clear the threat is twofold: Putin's aggression and US President Donald Trump's tumultuous stance on the Ukraine war. The real question in front of us, said the EU president, is whether Europe is prepared to act as decisively as the situation dictates, and whether Europe is ready and able to act with the speed and the ambition that is needed. Right now it isn't. That's why Europe is entering an era of rearmament, claims von der Leyen. But to rearm, Europe first needs money, a lot of it. That's why von der Leyen has just announced a staggering new defense spending package called Rearm Europe. Under her proposals, the EU will free up a monumental 800 billion euros, approximately $857 billion, that its member nations will use to invest in their defense and provide even more support to Ukraine. The announcement comes just 2 days after several European leaders held an emergency summit with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the wake of Zelensky's disastrous meeting with US President Donald Trump at the White House. That meeting saw the two leaders battle back and forth, with Trump at one point telling Zelensky, "You're either going to make a deal or we're out." Trump also claimed that Zelensky had disrespected him in a post on social media. "I have determined that President Zelensky is not ready for peace if America is involved," Trump raged. "He disrespected the United States of America in its cherished Oval Office. He can come back when he's ready for peace." That statement sent shockwaves through Europe. The implication was that the US would pull out of peace negotiations related to the Ukraine war, at least for the foreseeable future. For many in Europe, that would essentially play right into Putin's hands. Without the US to lead those negotiations and provide a military threat that exceeds Russia's, Europe will be left alone to deal with the Ukrainian crisis. President von der Leyen's new defense spending proposal is the EU's response to the US appearing to withdraw. "We are ready to step up," von der Leyen said in her statement before outlining exactly what the EU plans to do. It's not going to outright hand over $857 billion to its member nations. The organization doesn't have that type of money just sitting around. And even if it did, the distribution of such a massive sum in one go would almost certainly lead to other EU members questioning von der Leyen's approach. So how is the money going to be distributed? The answer lies in the 5-step plan von der Leyen announced in her statement. Step 1, ease the EU's spending rules. Right now, all EU member states have to follow rules that oblige those countries to keep their public deficits below 3% of their gross domestic product, or GDP. Those rules are outlined in the Stability and Growth Pact, or SGP, which was first instituted in 1997 and amended in 2005. Even then, enforcement of the pact was weak, leading to the creation of a new fiscal pact in 2012 that introduced even stricter provisions than the SGP. The EU has these pacts in place to monitor member nations' spending, especially given that several EU members have experienced financial collapses while being part of the Union. Greece experienced a financial crisis between 2009 and 2018 caused by high government spending. Other EU members, such as Italy, have high debt-to-GDP ratios, with Italy's ratio currently being around 6-5. Von der Leyen doesn't intend to get rid of the SGP. Instead, Step 1 of Rearm Europe involves the activation of a national escape clause within the pact that frees up EU member states to spend more money on their defense. The EU president says that member states could realistically increase their defense spending by 1.5% of their GDPs each, thanks to this clause. If all do so, that would create new defense funding of around $696.5 billion over the next 4 years. The shackles are off Europe's most powerful nations. They now have permission to spend more on defense than they have in decades. And von der Leyen's plan goes even further. Step 2 is the creation of a new facility that can provide up to $160 billion of loans to EU member states. These loans will only be granted if the member states commits the money to targeted defense investment, and they're opt-in only. No EU member is forced to take out one of these loans. That decision overcomes the bureaucratic issues related to EU-wide joint borrowing, which is opposed by several member states. This is basically about spending better and spending together, says von der Leyen. We are talking about pan-European capability domains, for example, air and missile defense, artillery systems, missiles and ammunition, drones and anti-drone systems, but also to address other needs from cyber to military mobility. EU nations can also borrow from this pool of cash to massively step up their support to Ukraine. Think about it like this. An EU member nation may not have the money it needs to both raise its defense budget and support Ukraine as much as it would like. Under these new guidelines, that nation can now borrow a portion of a 160 billion cash pot to fund the procurement of European-made arms for Ukraine, while still being able to dedicate as much of its own money as it's able to its own defense. It's the best of both worlds for EU nations. They get to spend on themselves and support Ukraine under the new plans. And it gets better. While Steps 1 and 2 cover the majority of the $857 billion the EU is planning to spend on defense, Step 3 allows EU nations to repurpose cohesion funds. The EU Cohesion Fund was created to support EU member states that have a gross national income, or GNI, per capita below 90%. It's essentially a support fund. Richer EU nations contribute to the Cohesion Fund, with poorer nations taking from it to improve their economies and social structures. The idea is to have a shared pot of money that leads to the strengthening of the EU as a whole by picking up its economically weaker nations. Since 2021, the Cohesion Fund has supported all three of the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Cyprus, Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, Croatia, and several others have also received money from the fund. The EU also allocates 37% of the cash held in the fund to climate objectives. The Cohesion Fund isn't going away under von der Leyen's new proposals. However, she's now giving the fund's contributors the option to pull money away to support defense investments, along with creating Cohesion Fund programs that make it easier for recipient nations to spend on their defense. That's a lot of money potentially being freed up. According to the European Commission, the EU has dedicated $420 billion to its cohesion policy for the period between 2021 and 27. The Cohesion Fund falls underneath that policy, along with several others. Step 3 of von der Leyen's plan could free up billions of dollars more for European defense. Step 4 and 5 will involve mobilizing private capital for defense spending. The EU plans to accelerate the creation of a savings and investment union that will make it easier for private companies to access capital they can use to build weapons. The EU also plans to lift limits on defense investments made by the EU's lending arm, the European Investment Bank. Von der Leyen didn't provide many more details regarding those final two steps, suggesting they'll take place over the long term, while the first three steps account for Europe's short-term military spending needs. But by now you might be wondering how the EU's proposals demonstrate that it's had enough of the United States. To understand how the two are connected, we need to look beyond what's happening and explain why von der Leyen is making over $857 billion available to EU member states. On March 4th, President Donald Trump announced that he'd suspended the delivery of all US military aid to Ukraine. The decision blocks billions of dollars worth of crucial weapons shipments that have already been committed to Kyiv. The decision came on the back of the meeting between Trump and Zelensky we mentioned earlier and affects the delivery of ammunition, equipment, and vehicles promised to Ukraine under former President Joe Biden's administration. Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal says that Ukraine still has the means to supply its frontline forces after Trump's announcement. However, the loss of US aid will put several of Ukraine's American-made air defense systems, including the powerful Patriot system, at risk soon. We will continue to work with the US through all available channels in a calm manner, Shmyhal said. We have only one plan: to win and to survive. It's no coincidence that the EU announced its new spending plans on the same day Trump cut off aid to Ukraine. As Russia celebrated the decision, with Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov claiming that the US has been the main supplier of this war so far. The European nations that weren't informed of Trump's decision ahead of time were more somber. A Polish foreign ministry spokesperson said Trump's decision has great political significance, especially as it was made without consultation with NATO or the Ramstein group of 57 countries that have coordinated aid to Ukraine during the war. The EU will also hold an emergency summit on March 6th to discuss Trump's actions. Alexander Mereshko, who's the chair of Ukraine's Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee, provided the most damning analysis of Trump's decision. To stop aid now means to help Putin, claimed Mereshko. On the surface, this looks really bad. It looks like he's pushing Ukraine toward capitulation, meaning accepting Russia's demands. The EU's new funding plan takes on a new light under this context. Specifically, the second step of the plan seems engineered to overcome the military aid shortfall that will result from the US suspending its support. European nations can borrow money to support Ukraine, filling the gap. But more worrying for Europe as a collective is what Trump's decision may mean for the future of the continent. If withdrawing support plays into Putin's hands, as Mereshko claims, Europe has to face the prospect of an ascendant Russian leader who may turn his sights to other countries once he takes Ukraine. And given that the US is willing to withdraw aid to Ukraine, Europe has no guarantees that it will support the continent in a wider war. Europe simply has to get stronger. The $857 billion von der Leyen is committing now, plus whatever else is spent via steps 4 and 5 of her plan, will help the continent develop that strength. It also can't escape notice that the EU's spending plan roughly matches America's defense budget. The US spent $824.3 billion on defense in the 2024 fiscal year. The EU now plans to spend over $25 billion more than that, albeit over the next 4 years, which could be seen as an attempt to fill a US-sized defense funding gap that has just been created. America's approach to Ukraine over the last few weeks has also likely influenced the EU's decision. As The Guardian points out, the explosive White House meeting between Trump and Zelensky is far from the only time the two leaders have clashed. Trump's direct approach to ending the war in Ukraine saw the US hold a meeting with the Russians in Saudi Arabia in February that didn't include anybody from Ukraine. That meeting gave the impression that Ukraine was being cut out of any potential peace negotiations. Trump has also referred to Zelensky as a dictator on social media, while claiming that he doesn't have the support of the Ukrainian people. To say their relationship is contentious would be an understatement. And now, with US funding withdrawn, Ukraine's entire future is in doubt. Europe has to prepare for whatever the next few months and years may hold. Von der Leyen knows that very well. She wrote to EU leaders claiming that a new era is upon us when she announced her dramatic new spending plans. Europe faces a clear and present danger on a scale that none of us have seen in our adult lifetime. It's not clear whether the EU anticipates a future war with Putin. However, the continent wants to be prepared for such a fight. After all, a Putin victory in Ukraine gives Russia access to a country that borders Moldova, Romania, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. Ukraine could be the launching point for future invasions into Central Europe, which the EU can't allow to happen. Taking any of those countries would give Russia even deeper access into the continent, making Putin a direct threat to all of Europe. The third reason for von der Leyen's announcement has nothing to do with the US at all. Europe hasn't been spending anywhere near enough on its collective defense. Von der Leyen hints at this in her press release, especially when she notes how her new plans will release EU nations from the spending restrictions that have led them to sidelining defense for years. We can see that spending shortfall when examining how many European countries reached NATO's 2% of GDP spending on defense targets. According to Erste Group, the period between 2014 and 2024 saw only Poland, Estonia, and Greece consistently meet that target. Most other European NATO members were patchier, with most spending less than 2% or only raising their defense budgets following Putin's invasion of Ukraine. That has created a spending gap based on the 2% target, according to Erste Group, that would require around $1.009 billion to fill. The EU's new spending plans more than fill that spending gap. However, it's important to note that this only accounts for the money the collective EU should have spent if all of its nations hit the 2% target. An extra $1 billion is minuscule in the grand scheme of what's happening on the continent. The reality is that filling a small spending gap isn't enough to cover the strengthening that's required in Europe. Former Vice President of the European Commission, Josep Borrell, revealed this back in December 2022. While lauding Europe's collective response to Putin's Ukraine invasion, he also pointed out that the war has been a brutal wake-up for many of us. We realize that our military stockpiles have been quickly depleted due to years of underinvestment. Borrell implies that European nations have been forced to weaken themselves to send weapons to Ukraine. We realize that we lack critical defense capabilities. We lack the capabilities that we need to defend ourselves from a higher level of threats, Borrell added. Russia is that higher level of threat. So von der Leyen's announcement could be a counter to years of European underspending. It not only fills the 2% of GDP gap highlighted in the Erste Group report, but also looks set to accelerate the European defense sector so the continent can catch up to where it should really be as a collective force. The $857 billion spending plan is the remedy to a problem that Europe should have long since solved. So what happens next? According to France 24, it isn't yet clear how quickly the EU can mobilize the funds promised under von der Leyen's proposal. The EU president's plan also needs to receive approval from the organization's member states, which could create a bureaucratic roadblock that may take months to clear. Hungary and Slovakia in particular could present problems. The leaders of both countries already threatened to block key EU statements on March 1st unless the EU called for an immediate ceasefire, along with launching peace talks with Russia. Von der Leyen's plans seem to be the opposite of what Hungary and Slovakia want, which could lead them to disapproving of the funding idea. The results will be visible more likely in weeks or months, rather than immediately, claims European Council on Foreign Relations member Camille Grahn. But it makes a difference, she adds, since that's when the American restrictions will start to bite. Others were less excited by the news. Guntram Wolff, who's part of the Belgian think tank Bruegel, says that the EU's measures were a step in the right direction, but were not a game changer when it comes to the Ukraine war and how Europe will handle Putin in the future. Wolff expressed hope for a more ambitious debate, potentially releasing even more money, once EU powerhouse Germany has its new government in place. Other European leaders had a more upbeat response. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said von der Leyen's plans were an important first step to what she calls the quantum leap to strengthen our EU defense. The consensus appears clear. As massive as an $857 billion influx of cash into Europe's defense may be, for the continent and Ukraine, more needs to be done. Still, this is a powerful first step. It's also a move that has shocked the US at a time when it believed that pulling aid from Ukraine could be the key to forcing forward the peace talks between Kyiv and Moscow. And who knows, the EU's higher spending may just convince President Donald Trump to rethink his approach to Ukraine. After all, he's called on America's NATO allies repeatedly to spend more on defense in the past.